Thanks very much. I think I have some slides.
Oh.
Great. Okay. First slide, please.
Excellent.
I'm afraid to say, we had a big discussion about fear. Because it turns out, fear is a critical has a critical part to play in this. There are so many scales to these outbreaks. So we're concerned about modeling the risk of emerging infectious diseases. They're sporadic. They include some endemic diseases like Zika that then emerge and then become endemic again. So there's a crossover into endemicity. There are some real interesting scale issues. How does an individual respond? How does a household respond? How does a nation respond? And what is our global response? All those things are different. They're often irrational, depending on the outbreak. And what we talked about is we need more knowledge. So there are some real gaps. We basically need data on fear and how its effect at these different scales. We need more information on the geography of risk. We know for some diseases, like Ebola, for instance, we know where the reservoir is, we know where the likelihood, in a broad sense, of its future emergence is. But other diseases, it's a lot less clear. Some very widespread diseases, like Zika now, that's vector-borne, so it's all about where the vector is, and these things can shift very rapidly. When there's a change in the environment, vectors can explode, and you get an increase in disease. So understanding the risk around that is quite difficult. And it makes it difficult to set up clinical trials to actually do work to control those outbreaks at the right place and time. And an interesting question. During the Ebola outbreak, we saw that treatment was sort of triggered, or there was a rush to find new treatments, to fund new treatments when this became a global issue. What are the triggers for that? It has lasting impact and lasting economic impact, but is that going to be triggered in a random ad hoc way, depending on the amount of fear we in the West or the North perceive? Or is it going to be triggered in a thoughtful, science-based way? And I'm looking at Jay for that because he knows the answer. One huge data gap that we didn't actually talk about, but it came up a few times yesterday, is the cost, really the economic damages from these diseases. And Dean mentioned this at the beginning. We have an arms race in the cost of infectious diseases, from the millions to the trillions. Where is the reality of that? And how can we get some more objectivity into those measurements? We all know that a big cost is going to drive funding, so there's a push to go for a big cost. But let's get some reality into those checks. Next slide. So here are the challenges. It's difficult, a key issue. It's difficult to synergize data on behavior into models because the models we're working on are intrinsically larger scale than individuals. They're made up of a disease spreading through a population and then often internationally. So behavior data, social science data, qualitative, quantitative, is extremely context specific. So we need to deal with that. We need to generalize the very context-specific behavior if we're going to incorporate them into models. If we don't, we're going to continue to have models that are often believed by responders and by agencies that are not actually accurate. I think this key issue is we're trying to model a set of social systems and a set of biological systems at the same time, and this came out in some of the talks. So how can we deal with this and include also emerging diseases, endemic diseases, and diseases that seem to cross the barrier? AMR is a good example of that. And one very key point at the bottom there is how do we then communicate the results from these models? So we saw a nice range of this on day one. We saw some nice equations, and I think every model talk should have an equation in, but just do it really quickly and move on. The key thing is you need your results to be understood by policymakers, decision makers. They're often not well understood. They're not communicated well. And what happens is you end up with two camps, really. People who believe the model and the outputs of the model and just run with it and kind of over believe it and think it applies to all circumstances, or don't realize the very context specificity or the specific question you were trying to address with that model. Or you get people who've seen so many models that they just don't like them and they don't think they're any value. We need to avoid that. And I think one way to do that, and this came up a lot in the discussion, is how we communicate the results of the model needs to be simplified, and it needs to talk about the uncertainty. We need better ways to measure uncertainty, but we need to talk about the uncertainty or the limits to the model's power when we describe them. I think the next slide should be the last slide. Strategies. I think the fear that we talked about also includes people who do the work. Modelers are afraid of their own models being too general or being overinterpreted. And I think we need to avoid that. I think we need to really grasp this difficult strategy of bringing behavioral data into models. If we don't, we have an obsession with R0 that is fairly meaningless. If we're really going to make decisions based on science and using these models, which they are really good at, we need to deal with the concerns that we have ourselves about how accurate they are and just communicate the uncertainties better. There are strategies for getting better models, and one of them is to use game theory, stochastic dynamic approaches to make the models more accurately represent what's happening in the dynamics of an outbreak. Using data to underpin the models, to parameterize the models on the fear factor. But we need to know how that scales geographically with different outbreaks. Some outbreaks are quite small. How does the size of an outbreak ultimately correlate with the fear or adaptive response? And how does that fear and adaptive response change during an outbreak? Behavioral economics will help a lot in this, and we need to reach out to that community and bring them into this. And there are solutions here too. There are intermediate approaches using system dynamic models that form a sort of halfway house from the extreme behavior-rich, qualitative focus group type survey information through to the other extreme, which is an economic toy model with no data at all. All of these are used to make decisions. I guess there's another extreme, which is 4 folks in a room making a decision based on nothing, which is also still used. And we need to avoid that. We need to think about the time issues more carefully. There are slow, long-term risks, like climate change, of which there's been a lot of talk. And that leads to a lack of interest or concern that's irrational. And maybe the same thing is going on with AMR right now. Maybe we can use some of what's been done for climate change and adapt that into our modelling approaches for things like AMR. Or things like pandemic risk, where the public and the policymakers will lose interest because there hasn't been a big influenza pandemic. And the next meeting of this forum will be on that pandemic risk in November. That's a plug for that. So we need to simultaneously address the lack of fear in policymakers sometimes with the excess fear. And we talked a lot about an example of the lack of fear, things like the TB and the malaria issues, or HIV right now, the lack of concern, and the excess fear being the hyped up and over-the-top response to 2 or was it 3 cases of Ebola in the US that it wasn't even an outbreak. But you look at the cost of that, it was absolutely disproportionate. I think that's where we ended. Can you just flick the next one over and see if there is anything? Oh yeah, let's quickly go through that. Here are the stakeholders that are involved in this. So we had an interesting discussion, I'll be very quick, with Moderator, who are working with the insurance industry to try and find a market, to develop a market. I think that's going to test out these ideas. But let's not forget outbreak responders and work with them to try and validate the models during outbreaks, including surveys of how fear changes over an outbreak. We need to work with social scientists and anthropologists, but we also need social scientists that want to be able to generalize their data from the very context-specific through to these general models. That's a very difficult thing for many social scientists to do. So we need a bit of a shift in that side too. And there are some other sectors that are involved. Hopefully that's the final slide. I'm going to stop right there.
Thank you very much. Let me just see if there are any urgent comments from the floor from those who were in Group 1. If not, we'll move straight to Group 2, which focused on creating a sustainable economic model to stimulate R&D for antibiotics.